Hello and good afternoon. My name is Catherine Klein and I'm a Senior Research Associate at the National Regulatory Research Institute, NRRI. So today is our final installment of our 4-part webinar series on delinquencies and disconnections, which is part of an ongoing collaboration between NARUC's Committee on Consumers and the Public Interest and the National Association of State Utility Consumer Advocates, also known as NAZUCA, and the National Regulatory Research Institute. If you did not tune into our earlier webinars, don't worry, you can catch the recordings on NRRI's new YouTube channel, and that's just under NRRI Media on YouTube. As a housekeeping note, GoToWebinar allows us to ask questions, and so not only can you do that, we encourage it. And so we'd like to invite the audience to ask questions at any time using the question section of the GoToWebinar toolbar. I'd like to quickly introduce our moderator for today's webinar before we get started. This is Commissioner Marion Gold. So Commissioner Marion Gold has previously served as the Commissioner of the Rhode Island Office of Energy Resources, which is the OER. As a leader of the OER, Dr. Gold was dedicated to working with public and private sector partners to provide sustainable, secure, and cost-effective energy services to all sectors of the community. Prior to joining the OER, she was the director of the Outreach Center at the University of Rhode Island, where she established the URI Partnership for Energy and directed extension programs for communities and the public in energy, environmental, horticulture, and urban agriculture. She served on the URI President's Council for Sustainability and also on the RI Energy Efficiency and Resources Management Council. Finally, I wanted to give Commissioner Gold a shout out because she is on the NRI's board, and we really appreciate all of the work she's done there. And with that, I will pass it over to Commissioner Gold. Thank you so much.
Well, thanks very much, Catherine, and woohoo to NRRI. It's great to be on their board. Really appreciate all the good work that you guys do. And welcome to everyone who has joined us today. I am really excited to be back moderating the final webinar in this 4-part series. Our goal for the series was to have a focused recommendations on best practices for the regulatory community with respect to consistent data collection and reporting models that we can use to better serve customers who struggle to pay utility bills. And we started this work back in May. We've had 3 webinars to date. This is our 4th. We've had a robust and wide-ranging conversation over the course of the series. In our kickoff webinar in May, we learned that terminations are increasing and arrearages are growing across the country despite many great energy assistance programs. We discussed the value of collecting better data to monitor the problem, and we reviewed the challenges that we face to make sure that the data provide information that we can use to improve affordability, reduce terminations, and lower uncollectibles. Then in our 2nd and 3rd webinars, we continued the conversation. We shared a lot of examples from regulatory commissions regarding how various states are collecting standardized data from utilities, and then we zoomed in on some success stories as examples of best practices in a lot of different areas. To prepare for this webinar, our final webinar, and also to set the stage for the future work with NARUC, NAZUCA, and NRRI, as well as our outside stakeholder groups, we asked the speakers from the previous panels to provide their top recommendations for next steps and best practices. So today we're going to share some of the recommendations that we received. We divided them into 4 categories. The first set of recommendations addresses best practices related to the development of standardized language and definitions. Standardizing definitions was identified early on as a crucial first step in the data collection effort. Utilities, regulatory commissioners, and stakeholder groups often have different definitions for the same term or for the same process, and this makes it difficult to collect, exchange, and interpret data and information. So we want to make sure that the data that we collect is actually useful and improves our understanding. The second suite of recommendations focuses on data collection practices, the identification of the types of data that we should collect or could collect and report on, and the practices that are associated with making sure that the data are valid, reliable, used appropriately, and effectively. And there's a third bundle of recommendations which focuses on best practices associated with programs to address evolving customer preferences and needs. And this whole bundle of recommendations addresses the need to better understand different types of customers and also really hones in on the challenges and the opportunities that we're encountering as our energy and our water utilities are modernized. The systems are changing, the technology is changing, and our programs and reporting methods need to evolve as well. And then finally, we're going to talk about a whole bundle of recommendations associated with reducing utility delinquencies and disconnections. We have, again, a great suite of speakers today. These are all folks who have participated in one of our past webinars and who have provided some of the recommendations that we'll talk about today. We've asked each of the speakers to comment on the recommendations above from the ones that I mentioned from their particular perspective. So there's going to be different perspectives on kind of the bundle of things that we're going to talk about. We will have time for questions in between panelists and following the presentations. And as Catherine said, I want to emphasize that we really do appreciate questions from the audience. It's a good opportunity to take advantage of these folks. A brief introduction. Our first panelist is Dr. Nike Adeyeye, Chief of Staff for the Office of the Honorable Martha Guzman Aceves from California. I'm getting those names a little bit wrong. Ananike will discuss experience with collecting utility data on disconnections in California. Also joining us today is Tyrone Palooza, Utilities Examiner from the Connecticut Office of the Consumer Counsel. She has been deeply involved in efforts to improve and standardize the data collection process, work that was undertaken when in Connecticut they observed a sharp increase in terminations and arrearages. We talked about that on the first webinar. Next, we'll have Dr. Gabriela Sandoval, the Director of Strategic Initiatives with Utility Reform Network, or TURN. She's got a great national perspective on disconnections and delinquencies and how we can collect and use data most effectively. Then we'll have David Collada, the Executive Director of the Illinois Citizens Utility Board. He's going to join us to talk about some of the really important work underway in Illinois with smart meter data and how we can maximize consumer benefits from data analysis. And finally, we'll have Nat Treadway. Nat is the Managing Partner of Distributed Energy Financial Group and the leader of the Low Income Energy Issues Forum. He's going to discuss opportunities to reduce delinquencies and disconnections by giving customers more service choices. Following the panelists, Charlene Ketchum from the Staff Subcommittee of NARUC's Consumer and the Public Interest Committee, and David Springay, the Executive Director of NASUCA, will join us to discuss the next steps on this project. So again, I want to encourage everyone to send in questions as they occur to you. And now I will turn it over to our first speaker, Adanike from California. Take it away.
Hi, thank you, Commissioner Gold, and thank you, Catherine, for organizing. My name is Adanike Adeyeye. I am Chief of Staff to Commissioner Guzman Aceves at the California Public Utilities Commission. And we provided some recommendations about our practices around data collection that we've developed over the past, I'd say, year and a couple of months as we've opened and run a proceeding with the goal of reducing disconnections in California. So I'm going to share some of the best practices and the goals that we've established and some tips for the best ways to go about collecting data relating to utility disconnections. So the next slide, please, or do I click the slides? Oh, great, thank you. So just an overview, I'll talk about our goals in collecting data on disconnections, some quick tips for data collection that we've experienced here in California, and also just so folks know, Janelle Shu, who's the lead analyst on disconnections at the CPUC, is here with me too. So if there are any questions about our tips or our experiences, she's also going to be here to help answer questions. And I'll show I have a couple of brief slides, just, examples of the data collection template that we've issued out to the utilities to report back to the Commission monthly on the status of disconnections in their service territory. And then I'll talk a little bit about how data has influenced our work and the policies that we're developing around reducing disconnection rates. Next slide, please. So I'll get to that, I guess, in a second, but just to talk about our three main goals around collecting disconnections data. The first really is setting a baseline to evaluate progress at a future date. This proceeding came out of legislation that directed the Commission, among other things, to reduce the rate of disconnections by 2024. And to do that, you need to know what you're starting from. And so one of the first matters to address in the proceeding that we've opened is establishing a baseline from which to decide, are we reducing disconnections? What is our baseline year? That's still something that's under discussion. We've had a series of workshops and comments from parties. But in the interim, in December of 2018, we issued a decision that required, or that encouraged the utilities to keep their disconnections at a rate at or below their 2017 disconnection rates. So while we're figuring this out, we're treating the 2017 year as a year we don't want to exceed in terms of higher disconnection rates. Another main goal has been figuring out who's most impacted by disconnections. So we're looking at gathering demographic data and income level data and comparing that with data around disconnection rates and zip codes and seeing how different socioeconomic factors are associated with higher or lower disconnection rates. And the last thing is figuring out where the problem is most severe and most extreme. We've looked at different geographic locations that experience the higher and lower disconnection rates, so collecting disconnection data by zip code, which I think Gabriela Sandoval might talk a little bit about, because Turn's work and a report they developed that included some of the top 10 zip codes for highest disconnection rates in each service territory really informed that data gathering effort on our part. We've also looked at identifying which groups of customers experience the highest disconnection rates, and this slide just shows the reporting, a piece of the reporting document that the utilities have to use every month, and it's broken out showing number of customers requesting bill assistance or having ongoing payment plans by CARE users, which is our low-income discount program, FARA users, people who are on medical baseline, so have a medical need for their utility service and get discounts. So we've broken those up by different customer categories to try to figure out who is the most impacted. We've also looked at recurring disconnections. And so another reason that the geographic distribution is really important for us in terms of collecting data is that we've actually been able to use that in other proceedings as well, which I can talk about a little bit more at the end of, when I'm talking about how we've used data to address policies around disconnections. Some of the quick tips that we would want to share with you all are actually also related to this slide and the next slide. One of the things that we, in hindsight, realized we should have done, which is very simple, is requesting data in a specific format. Now we get data from the utilities in Excel format, but at first, if we didn't request it, we would get it in varying formats, and it was difficult to do any kind of analysis on that data. So it's a simple thing, but I would really recommend just trying to direct as much consistency as you can, because otherwise there will be inconsistencies that'll make the data less usable or more resource intensive to use. I would consider just thinking really carefully about the timing of the request you're making for data, whether to utilities or to other groups. It does take time on the other end to collect the data, and so we've had to juggle timelines in terms of making sure we've had the data we need to move forward in the proceeding. It's been important for us to communicate with the folks we're working with to get data and to make sure that we're expressing which pieces are our key priorities, the things we need sooner versus later. And then the last big tip is to request data in as granular a form as possible. The next slide, I think, is an example of a question that produces data that isn't as flexible as we ideally would have liked. So it's about the number of customers who are in arrears who owe the utility, and it's broken down in buckets. So number of customers in arrears overall, and then there's a subset, number of customers who are 31 to 60 days in arrears, a number of customers who are 61 to 90 days in arrears. Those are helpful buckets in terms of, whether you're 60 days late versus 30 days late versus 90 days late does have an impact on your likelihood of being disconnected, but it doesn't give us the more specific, data where we can do an average of how late or how far in arrears customers are. So you would need more granular data to be able to do that. That can raise sometimes some issues around data sharing and privacy issues, but it's something to just think about and to weigh, you know, is that information important enough that you want to try to figure out a way to get it and avoid any of the data sharing or privacy issues, or, you know, is it appropriate to have the buckets? Can you live with that? So I would just encourage you to think about, you know, how granular of a data set do you need, and to, I guess, when in doubt, maybe err on the side of getting more detail than less. And then the next slide is another high-level point that I think is really important for the data collection work that we've done in California. It's really important to think beyond just the spreadsheets and just the stats. We have had a series of workshops. We've had 6 overall, 3 last fall, and then 3 this summer. So we've had 3 workshops since the last time that Commissioner Guzman-Aceves spoke at one of the webinars in June. And we sought out data beyond, you know, just statistics that were from utilities or from other providers. The commissioner really values information from customers, from people who are impacted by disconnections, and from service providers. So we did outreach to community groups and service providers to encourage their attendance at workshops. And we reached out to other states that have implemented programs that we want to consider. We had, for example, Philadelphia come and speak about their tiered assistance program, which is for water bills, but ties your bill to your income. And we set up these workshops so that community members and community-based organizations could come and give their input in a way that could be recorded and put into the record of our proceeding. So this data collection makes the decision-making more robust, and it also makes the data set more robust. It allowed us to go back, for example, and request additional information from the utilities, additional data to understand how they are interacting with, for example, service providers who provide LIHEAP benefits to customers were having trouble working with utilities, and we were able to go back and do data requests that helped us understand the problems, and now are helping us try to figure out some concrete solutions to those problems. So I would really encourage people to think beyond just the hard data and think about some of the data directly from people, from, you know, anecdotal experiences, those kinds of things. Those can be really helpful in terms of decision making. And then really quickly, just how this data influences the Commission's work on disconnections. As I said before, we have to set a baseline to figure out the target, to figure out how we're reducing disconnections by 2024 per legislation. So we're doing that. It's helping us improve how LIHEAP pledges are made and are honored based on what we've heard from people in workshops that's then been corroborated and discussed through data requests. And it's helping us determine what policies to pursue in this proceeding, you know, having people come and explain different policies that are underway in other states, like the Philadelphia example, and having that robust discussion has helped us develop more ideas. And having the disconnection data by zip code in across the state has helped us figure out what program, helped us figure out even beyond the disconnections proceeding, where to target certain programs that are focused on low-income customers to hopefully help customers lower their bills in these areas, so that there will hopefully be fewer disconnections in those areas. So we've had a lot of success in gathering a lot of data through the proceeding that we've been running, and now we're still in the phase of trying to develop a proposed decision and issue that. So there's not a lot more firm conclusions yet, but it's been a really fruitful process to have both the qualitative and the quantitative data throughout this year and some change. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Adeniki. That was really terrific, and I very much appreciate the emphasis both on, you know, quantitative data that you can use to measure the effectiveness of your programs, and also the outreach that you've done, the face-to-face and gathering anecdotal information. I agree that that is super important. We have quite a few questions. We have time for maybe 3. The first one is a clarifying question about moratoria. Do you have shut-off moratoria in California for hot or cold weather? And if so, how do you factor that into your data collection efforts? You track those?
We do. That's actually a really good question. So we did not have them until the December 2018 decision, which issued moratoria for days that are above 100 degrees and below 32 degrees, if that's going to happen in the forecast for the next 3 days and people can't be disconnected. So we're able to track that. We've been tracking disconnection data before not moratorium, but before that temperature moratorium went into place. So we're hopefully going to be able to see how that's changed over time this year.
Thank you. Another question has to do with the geographic data on disconnections. How have you used it specifically to target assisted programs, or maybe more precisely, who organizes and delivers those programs? Is that something that the Commission does, or do you work in partnership with other entities?
It's something that it hasn't been explicitly directed that any utilities have to use or target those specific communities, but the utilities have developed pilot proposals that are still in the proposal stage and are proceeding. And one community choice aggregator, one CCA, has developed a proposal where they would try to pair some of the low-income solar programs and target those to areas that have had high rates of disconnection and see whether that affects the disconnection rate. So it hasn't been fully implemented yet, but it's something that is being considered as a pilot.
Yeah, great. Thank you. That's really interesting. And a final question that just came in is a question about the 2024 goal. Do you have is it a percentage reduction goal that was established by the legislature? What's the nature? What's the metric for that?
So it's very broad. It is truly, the statute truly says must reduce the rate of disconnections by 2024. So we have the Commission has a lot of leeway, and the parties in the proceeding have a lot of leeway to determine what that is. So yeah, no firm percentage by the legislature. Yeah,
got it. Thank you. That is a lot of leeway. All right. Well, thanks so much. Lots to think about there. And we're time to move on to our next speaker, and that is Tyrone Palooza from Connecticut. Thank you very much, Adenike.
Thank you, Chairman Gold, and also thank you, Adenike. It is a pleasure joining the other panelists today in sharing proposed best practices to be considered for a data collection model related to disconnections and delinquencies. I would just like to share a statistic as a reference point to highlight Connecticut's electric affordability problem. Its largest utility provider, and this is information through October of 2018, had a total delinquent balance of over 130 million and approximately 70,000 electric service disconnects. So that's just a reference point to think about. Reflecting on the prior webinars in this series, we've previously asked the question, why are there delinquencies and disconnections? And we not only discussed the lack of standardized data collection and reporting state to state, but also the inconsistencies in terminology, which was previously mentioned by Chair Gold. For example, in Connecticut, an uncollectible account is one where the balance has been written off, which may not be consistent with other states. As pointed out and may be discussed by some of the other panelists, terms like delinquency and disconnection themselves seem to have inconsistent definitions. First slide, please. So for the purpose of today's webinar, I'd offer recommendations shown on the slide for consideration that could help to lessen the rise of utility shutoffs across the country. And these arose out of two recent Connecticut PURA dockets that will be referenced later. And these include developing and deploying a master data management strategy, as well as risk-based processes. Next slide, please. The prior webinar series indicated some factors that could be contributing to disconnections and delinquencies, including but not limited to automation as utilities deploy smart meters, mergers, possible issues with consolidation of billing systems, changes to customer situations like the winter moratorium, hardship, and/or medically protected accounts. Utilities need to identify how data synchronizes between systems and define flows for data updates between all the different systems they're using. This could be the customer information system, geographic information systems, workforce management systems, and customer relationship management systems. This way, regardless of where the data is stored, all the employees will have access to updated information. Once the utilities have quality data, they can better identify trends in customer behavior as well as utility performance. An example of utilizing this data to identify customer behavior is evident in the recent Connecticut PURA docket, which I have referenced on the slide, and it relates to the utilities' arrearage management programs that offer forgiveness on a portion of past due balances. The companies in their plan filing in that docket, and it was a joint filing by both of the utilities, stated that some of the goals of their arrearage forgiveness programs are to enhance service to financially challenged customers by providing a program that helps to maintain service continuity, to increase awareness of and participation in energy assistance programs, and to increase the frequency of payments from delinquent, financially challenged customers by offering the incentive of an arrearage forgiveness program. With specific reference to the state's largest utility matching payment program, called MPP, it will match a customer's payment plus the amount of energy assistance received on the account down to a zero balance. The program does consist of 2 phases, giving the customers the opportunity to receive 2 separate matching payments. So they have phase 1, which is November through May, which incorporates the moratorium, and then they have phase 2, which is May through October. Additional details on the matching payment program as well as the New Start program are all discussed in the docket, which is why I provided a link if anyone wanted to reference additional details. Next slide, please. Customizing treatment for customers of different risk levels can enhance customer service and reduce collections costs for utilities. With quality data, utilities can use the analytics to segment customers into risk pools. So thinking about high-risk customers, when these customers enter the first stages of delinquency with a past due bill, they should immediately receive treatment. That can be in the form of a phone call, a notice, a bill insert, etc. Additionally, shortening the timeline for collections activities up to and including termination of service should prevent the customers from incurring unpayable high-dollar bills. Customers who have already incurred a balance high enough to warrant a payment arrangement typically are unable to fulfill the obligation of both a regular bill and also their payment arrangement. One Connecticut utility discusses their efforts to mitigate the risk of non-payment by increasing disconnections to help reduce overall outstanding balances in the active docket that I've referenced on the slide, and that docket is related to uncollectibles. They stated in a filing in that proceeding, the smaller the balance, the higher the propensity for the customer to pay that balance. And I just point out another side note here that in Connecticut, medical customers' uncollectible balances are growing at an exponential rate. Payments aren't being made even when customers do have the financial means to pay. So improvements to the qualification for medical protection are also needed, and this has come out of the docket. So again, I've referenced that docket, which is active currently at PURA. Now, alternatively, for low-risk customers, creating extended delinquency timelines or offering more lenient policies are just some options that could be offered by the utilities. Again, so I stayed high level here, and it's just 2 recommendations that have come out of current dockets here in Connecticut. If there's any questions, otherwise I can turn it over to Dr. Sandoval, who will be providing additional proposed best practices.
Well, thank you so much, Tyra. And we do have a couple of questions that came in.
Great.
For you. Yeah, one has to do, well, you have some large utilities in Connecticut who serve customers not only in your state, but also throughout New England. Do you know if these utilities are beginning to standardize their data collection and their customer outreach programs across the different jurisdictions?
That's a good question, and that did come up during the proceedings here in Connecticut. Some states have different statutes or regulatory policies, so the utilities are trying to coordinate how they're handling their different programs that they have in the states, but again, that may be different based on any regulations within the current state.
Thank you. Yeah, and that's always a challenge for the utilities that cross state lines.
Yeah.
Yeah, thanks. And a second question is, have you done any or thinking about doing any of the kind of outreach that California has been doing with bringing in a variety of stakeholders? And have you seen a range of stakeholders participate in your docket, technical workshop?
Yes. Actually, that's a good question. Thank you for reminding me. I did make notes while Adenike was speaking and giving her presentation. Similar to how California is approaching this, what did come out in the recent proceedings is that the utilities, both of the utilities in Connecticut, work very closely with the community action agencies, and they actually have been holding focus groups to make sure that they're getting input from all of the applicable stakeholders, and also a lot of the financial hardship customers themselves through the community action agencies. So yes, we are working on that.
Great, thank you. That seems to be a theme that's emerged throughout our webinars, is the need to collaborate across groups as much as possible. So yes. Thank you for that. Yeah. Okay, I'm not seeing any more questions, so why don't we turn to our next speaker? It sounds like she's going to dovetail nicely with the previous speakers. So Gabriella, take it away.
Thank you, Commissioner Gold, and thank you to NRRI and NASUCA and NARUC for having me. And I am also very grateful to the other participants from whom I continue to learn so much. As stated previously, I'm the Director of Strategic Initiatives with the Utility Reform Network, and we've been very actively engaged in the disconnections proceeding that Adenike highlighted. We've also been very active in terms of attempting to standardize data gathered from the investor-owned utilities here in California. So if I could get the next slide, please. As part of a larger campaign to reduce shutoffs in California, TURN published a report, which I believe Adenike referenced earlier, and I'm happy to send out the link if anyone is interested. We were really trying to get a sense of how do we best measure energy insecurity. And so we started off with just the raw number of shutoffs in California, but we very quickly realized that what we needed was a broader picture of what was going on. And so as part of the process for thinking through what we might need for this webinar, I narrowed down the number of data points that we might request to be collected across the country in order to get a nationwide sense of energy insecurity. My logic here, and this is the data that you have in front of you, is for California, was that these 5 pieces of data in particular, plus total customers so that you can calculate rates, were some of the most critical for really gathering a full picture of energy insecurity. And so these are the average total number of customers, and of course, all of these data points, when disaggregated by customer type and by geography, that makes the data more robust and more useful for specific groups, for organizers, for community-based organizations, for commissions. But of course, the more granular data is, the harder it is to actually gather. And I was glad that Adenike mentioned that sometimes you ask a utility, for example, for their data, and it takes a while, and so to disaggregate it takes even more time and resources. So average number of total customers, the total number of disconnection notices is a really critical piece of information because it's also, notices are a way of collecting revenue. Customers 60 plus days in arrears. We at Turn think that if you're 2 months behind on a bill, that's probably a sign of something that's more kind of a harsher economic shock than just 30 months, but still kind of a recoverable moment where people might have, 2 months, a 2 month long setback, but might be able to get back on track. But we thought 60 plus days in arrears was a critical kind of threshold. Total disconnections for inability to pay, total unique disconnections, just to have a sense again of how many folks are being disconnected multiple times in a quarter or in a year. And then reconnections over time. And this was actually a really critical piece for us. It's not on this slide, but if you go to the next slide, one of the things that we didn't anticipate finding was that about 11 to 12% of customers are never actually reconnected. So it's important to know, and I know that Nat Treadway will speak a little bit about length of disconnection, which is really a critical aspect of this. 85% of California IOU customers are reconnected within 72 hours, but there is a critical number of folks for whom we just don't know what they do. So 11 well, for Southern California gas, that number is 31%, but because people can substitute electric use for gas use, but we see that the electric utilities have about 1 out of 10 customers who are never reconnected, and we don't know what they're doing. If they are just going for extended amounts of time, or if this is what we think as a hidden driver of displacement in California. Now, if you break this down by medical baseline program participants, so this is the medical protections program in California, if you can go to the next slide, you see an even starker image beginning to show up. 50% of PG&E's medical baseline participants were never reconnected, and about 30%, 1 in 3 customers for the other IOUs are also never reconnected. And so this also speaks to how important energy use can be for people who rely on it to for their medical equipment or for medical conditions, but also how much harder it can be because their bills can actually exceed very large amounts. Okay, so as part of my project, I did make a kind of survey of PUCs and just state consumer advocates to try to get at who is collecting this data and who isn't. So if I could get the next slide, please. The upshot of this was that it was clear we need standardized documentation and reporting of disconnection data and other energy and security data for all 50 states and Washington, D.C. I think I'm preaching to the choir here when I say that without this documentation, we are unable to measure and fully understand the magnitude of the national crisis in utility affordability. We cannot expect to effectively address a problem like energy insecurity without being able to measure it accurately and to describe it well. Without standardized data, we're unable to judge how different states fare in a comparative context, and we can't evaluate what policies and practices actually work, or which work within which context, without better and comparable data. So I'm just going to run through quickly the next 3 slides just to give you a sense, and I'm happy to forward my slides to anyone who's interested. But the next slide shows gives you a sense of how many states are actually collecting the data and who is not. So about 25 states are collecting data in Washington, D.C., and then about 14 confirmed that that data is not available. I did have about 10 states who I never heard back from. The next slide, please. I put together this table. It's very complicated. No need to look at the details here. And I'm also, again, happy to share the full. This is just a snapshot of the table. But what I want to highlight here is that, that there are a lot of differences among states in how they gather data and what data they gather. So next slide, please. To give you a sense, some states count and report shutoffs for non-payment, but some states lump non-payment and voluntary shutoffs together. Some states report shutoffs for vulnerable groups, and only vulnerable groups. Some states only report shutoffs during their moratoria, and other states only report shutoffs during the months outside of their moratoria, with the assumption that no one should be shut off during the moratorium. Some states lump in prepay programs in terms of their shutoffs, so folks who are on prepay and not prepay, and that can kind of artificially inflate the number of shutoffs. Some states include residential and commercial accounts. Some states only report data or only have data accessible for several years back. So you can begin to see how this data really shows a range of collection practices, reporting practices. I actually got data from one state that was handwritten on a handwritten table for each month. So these practices vary widely, and I think in order to get a sense of the national kind of magnitude of this problem, we really need to begin by gathering this kind of data. So with my last minute, I just want to shift gears a little bit and share some considerations for evaluating best practices that I've been kind of as a front row participant in our own disconnections proceeding here in California. I've really had a chance to think about this. So if I could get my last slide, please. It's very, I think when I first began this work, I had these ideas about, I had a list of approaches and programs that I thought would really be a panacea for addressing shutoffs in the state of California and potentially in other parts of the country. And, as I've really taken the time to think through how these different approaches impact one another, impact different communities, the viability of different approaches, I've come up instead with this kind of these higher order questions, if you will, that I think advocates and others really need to ask themselves when proposing approaches. So the first question is this a disconnection mitigation tool or a credit and collections tool? For example, it can be easy to argue that technology will automatically and magically make it easier to help customers avoid disconnections. We saw some of this narrative deployed in the discussion around smart meters in California. And while yes, it might be easier for certain customers to monitor their usage through the internet and the nexus of the internet and their smart meter, it also makes it easier to shut them off when they become delinquent. The second question is, who is your audience or who is your customer, right? Not all approaches will work for everyone. And here I like the example of arrears management programs. Arrears management programs will work for a subset of customers and not for others, right? If there is a person on a very low fixed income, an arrears management program might not work for them. But for subsets of low wage workers, it might make a huge difference. And so really paying attention to who is being helped by what approach is very important. The third question I would ask has to do with affordability. So this is at its root a structural issue. Energy insecurity is a structural issue. It's not an issue of personal responsibility per se. So no amount of financial or energy conservation education is going to allow someone who doesn't make enough money to make ends meet. And so we really need to be mindful of the fact that there's a whole system at play here, and how do we really get at lower disconnections without increasing arrearages if we don't address the broader structural problems. Now, that may or may not be in the hands of a commission or a utility company. It might be part of a larger system, but we really have to think about it in that way in order to find solutions that really address the problem. And then finally, we can't ignore equity. So in California, for example, all ratepayers might pay for infrastructure such as EV charging stations or rebates for rooftop solar, but not everyone benefits. And so we really need to be mindful of the ways that the system might also be structured inequitably. And so what can we do to get out in front of that to make sure that we're bringing everyone along and that everyone is able to afford utility service? So I'm going to wrap up with that, and thank you again. If anyone has any questions, I'm happy to answer those.
Terrific. Thank you so much, Gabriela. Really a great presentation. And we do have a couple questions that came in, and I will direct them to you first. The first one says, the never reconnected, which you discussed, are the group that become homeless. What data is there from the speakers or from you on the connection between disconnects and the homelessness in your jurisdiction?
That's a fantastic question. We actually expanded our Disconnections campaign to one county in particular where we were seeing a lot of displacement, and we are actually trying to tease out exactly that nexus. We've been working with a few organizations that see energy insecurity as a harbinger of housing insecurity, and really beginning to look at what people's utility payment behavior can tell us about housing loss, about displacement, about strategies that people use to manage, especially in a place like California where there isn't a long moratorium in the winter. So we're currently trying to tease out exactly what is going on there. We don't have answers yet. We were very shocked by some of those numbers, but we are actively working, and the utility companies have set up a fund where we've established a program called the SHARE program, where for people who are in subsidized housing or are ready to go into subsidized housing and are currently unhoused, they can have their utility debt paid off by the utilities so that they can access housing. Because one thing we are seeing is that for a subset of our unhoused population, utility utility arrearages are acting as the final barrier to being housed. And this, we really want to make sure that that's not the case, that that people who are unhoused and can get into housing can actually get into housing.
Yeah, good. Thank you. Good answer. Another question about your presentation is that it appears that the numbers of medical needs customers who never reconnect is high. Does TURN have any understanding about what's happening to those customers? Do the data indicate that they're moving to some other kind of housing situation, like a care facility? Or does this tie into a homelessness problem, or any other insights you might have?
We do believe that folks are becoming marginally housed, homeless, or ending up in a facility, but the data sadly doesn't tell us exactly what's happening there. So this is part of what we're trying to tease out with this new aspect of our project. And I'm hopeful we'll have some more solid answers within the next year or so.
Okay, great. Thank you. Well, it's really good work that you're doing at TURN. I'm sure it's great in California, and it's also very useful across the country, so we appreciate it. So we'll turn now to our next speaker, Dr. David Salado, the Executive Director of HUB. So take it away, David.
Thanks, Commissioner. It is great to be here. I want to thank NRRI, NARUC, and NSUCA for inviting me on this very important panel. I'm going to be talking today about anonymized AMI data. There are now, I think as people know, somewhere between 80 and 90 million smart meters installed across the United States, over half of residential customers, and I think growing. And there's a lot that we can do with that data to start honing in on some very important questions. But right now, it's very difficult to actually get access to that data. So that's what I'm going to be talking about today based on our experience here in Illinois. Next slide. So we do think, and this obviously goes beyond just the issue of disconnections and delinquencies, but we think that there's a big overlap as well on really using this data to identify the best strategies of dealing with various issues, various problems in the utility space. There are obviously rate design implications or rate design change implications that, with the AMI data, you can essentially know what the results would be. It helps you identify energy efficiency opportunities. You can do very in-depth socio-demographic analysis to really see how different types of customers use electricity. Ultimately, I think you can get to much fairer allocation of costs. I don't think we're too far away from predictive algorithms that identify money-saving opportunities for various types of customers depending on your usage patterns. Certainly, there's implications for the best locations for distributed energy resources. And as we start to deal with climate change and how we can do that affordably and equitably, that it really can help. This kind of data analysis can help identify the best GHG emission reduction strategies. Next slide. So for those of you who were on my webinar a couple months ago, I went over a paper that we just published in the Electricity Journal, kind of as an example of the types of things that can be done. This is a sort of the summary of a machine learning cluster analysis we did in Illinois with about 2.5 million smart meter data points. And what we found are, getting to the heart of the matter, 6 different essentially load shapes and usage patterns of residential customers. And if you look at the chart there on the bottom right, you can kind of see what they look like. And the moral of the story is that basically we found that low income customers, over half, are just in 2 clusters, what we call 2 and 4. It's the red and the weird brown looking line that are very flat and not much usage. And that, of course, has very big implications for a whole host of policies. So next slide. So how are we able to get access to this data in Illinois? Well, we have an anonymous data protocol that our ICC, our PUC here, approved. It's a series of rules that ultimately led to our utilities filing a tariff. And what I'm going to do here is, sort of as a straw proposal, put out best practices based on that. So I would characterize these as minimum protocols. There may be a way to be better than this, but I think it's a very good start, and I do think the Illinois model can be imported into other states, and that can lead to significant insights and important data analysis opportunities. So the first protocol is essentially the amount of data, how far you go back. Really is, at the end of the day, it's a storage question. And what we would throw out, this is what we do in Illinois, it's 24 months with a 30-minute increment. And we include the PLC, that's peak load contribution for those of you in PJM states. But the important thing here is it shouldn't just be energy-only data. A lot of states also have something along the lines of peak contribution or peak allocation or capacity allocation, and that's an important variable as well. There's a big intersection with equity and disconnection issues too, because one of the things that we found is that if there's an area where low-income customers are getting particularly screwed in Illinois, it is on essentially capacity allocation. So we want to make sure that that's included. It should be meter by meter data, not aggregated. In some states, we've seen a proposal that, at your lowest level of granularity, you aggregate that data together. We don't think there's any need for that. It should be real meter data, you just strip it of any personal identifiers. So essentially no specific address or anything, or customer number or anything like that. We would propose that ZIP+4 or census tract be the lowest level of granularity. That relates to the next 2 points, which that you do need a privacy screen, obviously, to make sure that people aren't personally identifiable. The privacy screen that we established here in Illinois, and I think a few other states have done the same, is what's known as the 15 by 15 rule. And basic gist of it is that any data set must include more than 15 customers, and that one of those customers can have 15% or over of total usage. I think there is a healthy debate about how much lower you could go than 15. I think personally I'm persuaded that you can and still preserve privacy. On the other hand, it's important that we, in our opinion, we move forward as quickly as possible and in as many states as possible so we can do comparative analysis. And we do think there's a lot that we can do with the 15 by 15 rule. And we would propose that as something that that is certainly a great start. Then the way it works is that if the privacy screen is tripped, so if there is a ZIP+4 that the privacy screen is tripped, well, then you just go to the next level of granularity. So ZIP+3, ZIP+2, and so on. And you need to have a process like that because, once you start getting out of urban areas, you will find that the census tract or the ZIP+4 screen is tripped. So you're going to need to have a follow-up process. I think the easiest way to do it we found is a CSV file with some sort of FTP transfer. I am not our tech people, so I know FTP is file transfer protocol. I know it helps speed things up, and I know we've got a ton of data, hundreds of gigabytes at this point in the cloud. And I know that in the difference between utilities here, it turned out that the one that used an FTP made our life a heck of a lot easier. So anything that can be done to just make sure that that folks can download the data in a quick fashion is much appreciated, certainly. I do think, regardless, you will need a data agreement between, ultimately, I guess it'll be the utility and any entity that is downloading the data. Ours is very short and sweet. I think that's all it really needs to be. And what it says at the end of the day is you're not going to sell the data, which you shouldn't be able to do in our opinion. And you're not going to do anything to reverse engineer. What I mean by reverse engineer is try to identify who someone personally is, or an address, unique identifiers. This is largely an academic question more than anything else, but if you were, there's some speculation that if you combined this type of data with other data sets that are out there and you have a massive amount of computing power, you might be able to hone in on various things. And so I think it's important for everyone's comfort just to include some sort of provision in any contract that, you're not going to do that with, obviously, if you did, there would be, you'd be violating, in our case, the Public Utilities Act. And then finally, on the first minimum protocols, I do think it's important to allow special requests. An example might be multifamily housing, another might be medical needs customers, where if you were to overlay that in a ZIP+4 census tract, it might pose some issues. But there's very important empirical questions we need to get at there, and I think there are ways that we can do that if we use slightly different kind of privacy protocols and standards. And so we should be open to special requests. We shouldn't assume that whatever rule that we establish, that could cover every possible situation. So I think it's important to have some sort of process laid out that on how those special requests can be handled. Next slide, please. So as far as policy recommendations, we would argue that all utilities with AMI, should file a tariff or standardized rules to provide the rules of the road so that researchers and others can get access to that. In our case, there is a small cost to access the data. That's where our commission came out ultimately. We were comfortable with that. I think that there's a policy argument to be made that there should be no cost, at least for nonprofit and academic purposes. In our case, it's a $650 one-time fee for nonprofits and academic institutions, and it's $1,300 for for-profit. That does raise the question of, are we limiting it anyway? We are not in Illinois, so if Amazon wanted to do it, they could. Our view is that's the way it should go. Really there's no reason to limit it to simply researchers or anything like that. I understand there could be a debate about that, but that's our view. I do think that the purpose of this data should be to identify money-saving opportunities and to improve equity and the overall operations of the system. I think ultimately we'd like to see an elimination or at least a mitigation of regressive rate designs, which, one of the easiest things to identify with this type of data is precisely that. The reason I say mitigate rather than eliminate is that it does get into tricky questions around, any rate design change. There's going to be, in any class, winners and losers. So for example, on the capacity construct that we would prefer on how you're allocating those costs, somewhere between 80 and 85% of low-income customers benefit. Of course, that means that some don't. And given, loss aversion and status quo bias, that does raise some policy questions. But I do think that at least with the data, we can analyze those issues fairly. And to the extent that there are issues in any policy change, we can handle those as side issues to be mitigated rather than kind of undermine the whole potential change. One of the things that we're working on right now with the data are exploring ways to lower the risk premium inherent in average rates. That's another thing that our analysis shows that this is particularly the case for low-income customers, that they're paying an awful high premium for average energy and capacity prices. And there are likely cheaper ways to manage that risk. One of the things that we're thinking through and working on right now is an hourly pricing program that would have guaranteed savings for low and moderate income customers. In effect, you could think of it almost like a budget billing plan or a banking mechanism where a certain percentage of the savings would be put aside every month in the event that eventually prices will rise above average rates, even though that doesn't appear to happen as much as people would assume. But those types of things, I think, are the next area that we're kind of looking at. Next slide. So for further information on this, I've put a link. It's probably hard to read, but I think everyone can download the presentation. This is where both ComEd and Ameren, our two large utilities, have essentially the tariff that they filed and had the rules, and you can learn from that. And then bigenergydata.info is where we've been sort of publishing the work that we've done, but also it kind of has the data access story in Illinois, procedurally speaking. The procedural aspect of it was actually a little bit complicated, but with multiple dockets, but I think we ended up in a good place. I think if we have an overall message, it's that we've got all this data out there. We really need to move beyond intuition on a lot of the big policy challenges that we face today. And it's really only by looking at the data itself that we can move beyond intuition and start identifying strategies that work and making progress. We've been disappointed that it's taken so long to get access to this type of data. We think that, of course, privacy is important, but there are plenty of ways to deal with that issue. And there's just a huge public interest in providing access to it so that researchers and others can start examining it and finding out, what works, what doesn't, what's fair, what's not, and we can argue these things based on that data rather than intuitions. So thanks, happy to answer any questions, and really appreciate being invited. This is a very important topic, every aspect of it.
Thank you so much, David. That was great, and it was a particularly terrific follow-up to the presentation you gave a few months ago. So really exciting to see the big questions and the ways you're thinking about using the data. So we have time for just a couple questions, and I'm going to give you a two-parter. can you tell us or provide some examples of someone who's been using the data and for what purposes and with what results? Is there anyone besides Cub using it? And that's part one. And then part two is, why do you think Amazon, for example, should be able to access the customer usage data?
Yeah, it's a good question, the first one. We know that that there are some researchers at MIT, at the University of Chicago, at University of Illinois that are using it. We know the Environmental Defense Fund for some of its work has downloaded it and is using it. We're not sure beyond that, but I think we probably could find out. We just don't really know at this point. It's only really been available for the last, year and a half, 2 years. But we're not, we're not aware of too much work that's beyond the kind of academic and analysis world. A little bit surprising to us, actually, because, there's a lot you can do that's kind of interesting on this stuff. As far as I brought up Amazon, I guess, a little bit to be polemical. I guess what I would say ultimately is I don't see any policy justification for just limiting it to nonprofit entities. And at least in principle, there should be a company like Amazon or others should be able, when I start talking about money-saving algorithms, it's folks like that who are probably in the best position to pull that off. Now, that doesn't mean it will all be used for good, of course, and we're very cognizant of that. But at the end of the day, I do think that it probably makes sense. Let's put it this way. It certainly can help innovation to have others having access to it who maybe think about it in a different kind of way. I do think personally that if there's a charge, that for-profit should pay significantly more, and it does raise. There is a public policy question there around, well, maybe the utility should sell it to an Amazon or an Apple or a Facebook or someone like that. I tend to think the answer to that is no, mainly on the intuition, I could be wrong about this, that it really won't be worth that much unless it was monopolized by someone. But I think one of the big problems in the world is that data is being monopolized, and I think that would be not a great public policy outcome. So I don't think a utility could actually make too much money off of this. So I think it's somewhat academic.
That's really, we could talk about this for a long time, but we're starting to run short. So thank you very much. Very provocative and really interesting. Time now for our final speaker, Nat Treadway, who always has lots of interesting and provocative things to say. So take it away, Nat.
Thank you very much. And I want to echo the others and thank NRRI, NARUC, and NSUCA for putting together these series of 4 webinars. And as I think people have just seen in the 4 previous presentations, there were a number of slides there that could have been a whole series of presentations just on one slide. A lot is being covered here. I think that reinforces what we all kind of suspected, that the issue of delinquencies and disconnections is very broad, hard to put our arms around. I think part of that is that the world is changing, technologies are changing. We've just seen a whole lot of information about just the data that we have access to over the last decade is changing. But also, I would point out that I think this still is in some ways a somewhat vague topic. And I say it's vague because, as we've heard, and as I'm going to echo in a minute in the slide, just the definition of what is a delinquency and the definition of what is a disconnection and how do you measure it, those are still somewhat nebulous at times. So that is so I've kind of made my first point here that you're going to see in a slide in a minute. So next slide. By way of introduction, let me just explain, as Commissioner Gold said in introducing me, my thoughts on this come out of 5 or so years of working with this Low Income Energy Issues Forum, and just want to put that out there in terms of letting people know that there's a group that's trying to work on new policies that can help broadly with this issue of energy affordability. Next slide. So, as I said, there's many issues that can be covered, but I decided that in making a presentation, I would basically just have 5 or 6 slides. So the bullets you're looking at here are pretty much the outline of what the 5 slides are. I'm going to talk just a minute about segmentation. Others have alluded to that in different ways, and talking about medical, talking about risk-related issues, and I'll have a little bit different take on it that'll help you see some of the way we're thinking about this in the group and the way we talk about it. But then I'm going to move into 2 areas. One is not telling you much new on definitions, but just this one finding and this one recommendation. And I'll explain these in a little more depth as we move into the next slides. But the second area is in the area of the policies and practices. As I put in the title, and you can see it with the last couple of words in the last bullet there, issues related to customers having choices, I think can provide some power. And so I've just taken a few things. I'm not presenting a lot of data to you, but hopefully a couple of ideas that can be useful. And then there's one slide at the end with some possible additional ideas and pilots that utilities could be engaged with and so forth. So let's move to the next slide. And this is the look at segmentation. So that group I referred to, we had late 2015, we had a workshop in which people began to talk about not talking about people that struggle to pay as just low income, and not talking about it as if it was a homogeneous group, that you had many dimensions. You've heard others talk about different dimensions. So what this little chart we found useful, talk about 4 quadrants, and the quadrants are along these axes of basically people's income or their ability to pay, and then people's intention of paying. The point here really is that depending on which quadrant you're looking at, the policies, programs, and offers are going to be different to solve the problem. So I won't be talking about what is labeled here, the irresponsible quadrant. That may be a relatively small percentage of people that aren't paying their bills. There are some unique ways that utilities are addressing that, and I won't say anything further on that. But I wanted to talk about the other 3, and in a minute you're going to see a little image in terms of where I think the focus is. But before we turn to that next slide, just let me point that the lower left quadrant, what we've labeled the overwhelmed quadrant, this is where the problem is extraordinarily difficult. The income is not there. The programs are going to need to continue. The discounts are going to need to continue. I'm going to turn my attention now, in moving from this slide to the next slide, turn my attention to the upper half here, in which you're looking at what we labeled the supported and the independent quadrant. So next slide. So jumping back to I said there are going to be 2 points, one on definitions, one on policies and practices. So on definitions, I'm going to go back, I think it was the first webinar in this series in which Roger Colton did an excellent job at going through a lot of what you heard re-emphasized today, but an excellent job at explaining how we just still, even now in 2019, lack uniform definitions, and we need to address that. So rather than recreate what he said very, very well and gave many fine examples for, and you heard more examples today, particularly in the details provided by California, that I'm just going to focus on something that I haven't heard, and that's this next area, which is when we talk about disconnections, if you think in terms of every disconnection being, a couple of days typically, then reducing the frequency or the number of disconnections is certainly, that's the goal. That's simple, just we need fewer of them. But if you realize that that they aren't the same length, and that disconnection has at least 2 dimensions of frequency and duration, a third dimension that I'm about to talk about is the timing and whether the disconnection is expected or unexpected. But let's just stick with frequency and duration. Then I presume everybody on this call is paying their bills and is not under threat of disconnection. But you can think in terms of other types of outages, like a storm outage. So which do you prefer? If someone could say, we can control the future, you can have a storm that gives you once a year, you're going to have a major outage for a week. Or we're going to have minor storms, and 5 times a year you're going to be out for 3 hours each. So you can choose there in terms of looking at what the inconvenience is, and what the total duration of hours is. Some people might choose the one that's shorter, the more frequent, and the fewer hours. And many of us would, I think, even though 5 times a year is inconvenient. But on the other hand, I think the real key issue is there's no right answer to this. People are individuals. And some people might actually opt for just once a year, give me a full week without power if I have to choose, and if we can control the weather in the future. And then that gets into, will I know when it occurs? Can I prepare for it? And so forth. I think this is a rather different way of thinking about disconnections. And I think it really emphasizes just the definition of it is important, and then of course the follow-up to that is, well, what data are we collecting? We heard lots of other examples about variants, different pieces of the data that are important that we need to collect, but I would simply emphasize that duration is a very important piece of the puzzle. Next slide. So this is not a surprising slide, but this is just, the surprise really is that in the large, bold, italicized at the bottom, that first sentence, that here we are, it's 2019, we've basically had statewide regulation of utilities for a century, and we don't have good definitions of this, and we don't have good data collected, so let's get it done. I think what California has done is excellent, but if you want to have things that are going to be in many, many of the states, you're going to have to accept that it's going to take a lot of people working to embrace and to reach compromise and embrace or buy into what they can accept, both in terms of definitions as well as in terms of standard reporting formats. And there are policy implications of all of this. So I think you all understand, this audience certainly would understand the complexity of it. Those of you like in California that have worked on it and addressed it for the California position can certainly appreciate that it's complicated, it's hard, and if we start to bring in 30, 40 or so states, it's going to be even harder. But if you want the comparability, it's work that just has to be done. Next slide. So there's a lot. The next bullet was the finding about, changing preferences and changing technologies. Each of these, dozens of presentations could be given. So I said, well, I'm not going to have time for dozens of presentations. Let me just pick one slide. So here's one slide from some data we collected in a national survey, a national consumer survey about a year ago. And I decided that the appropriate split here was to look at these 3 questions and to compare people in age that are 18 to 54 with people that are 54 and older. And so what are we talking about here in these 3 areas? The questions were related to a barcode payment option, a pay-by-day option, and a text-to-pay option. I'm not going to spend a lot of time to go into the details, but basically with a barcode payment option, you could have a barcode on your bill. Retail stores, many retail stores would have worked with the utility to agree that you can walk into that retail establishment, grocery store, or whatever, have them scan your bill or scan the barcode on your phone, and that's your account. And then you can add money to it. If somebody steals your barcode, well, then they too can add money to your account, so they can pay your bill for you. So it's a system that is being used by Georgia Power. It's something that some other utilities are looking at. So this is just looking at how younger people are a lot more excited about new things. And there's no real surprise there, but I thought it was worth at least talking about how preferences are changing and technologies are changing with these 3 examples. The pay-by-day is an idea in which, people talk a lot about bill stability. Well, with advanced meters, we have the ability to know in a granular detail of what people cost the system. You effectively can calculate what someone's cost was in some degree of detail with, say, 15-minute data based on their last year of usage. You can add risk premiums of that to deal with the uncertainty of fuel costs in the future with whatever changes on your tariff today. You can make changes. You can deal with premiums. You can, in fact, include the risk of weather being different and their usage being different. And you could set for people, say, one number, a cost per day for the entire year, or it could be a cost per day that's set every month, and many, many different ways to do this. There's some pilots going on in this regard. It's something, giving people certainty as to what their bill is, and not just certainty as to what the rate is, but giving them certainty as to what the bill is, the cost, in this case, the daily cost is. There could be a great deal of appeal there. And then finally, text to pay is kind of what it sounds like. Some utilities may have it. Younger people, millennials and Gen Z, this is the world that they live in, and they're very comfortable with that. Let me move on to the next slide. So the recommendation that comes out of that is give customers more choice and control, and rather than bore you with lots of specifics of lots of programs, I just have a list of bullets here, and you can let your own minds take you to be as creative as you want to as you begin to say, the solution is that those people, so I put that that red box up there to say, so now I'm talking about people that have at least minimal income, and they definitely want to pay their bills. They're not interested in programs generally. They don't want to go through the trouble. They just want a way to pay and keep track of and pay this bill, just like they're paying for groceries, just like they're covering the rent or the car payment or anything. You just have to make it easier. You have to meet them where they are. So allow them to pay frequently, whenever they prefer. Allow them to pay in advance, banking money for future bills. Allow them to pay whatever amount they have available. Not here's the bill, but what do you have available today? If in the gig economy, if waiting table or whatever, you have a good day, a good night, does that money go into a utility account where and easily go into a utility account where you don't have to worry then about the power in the future? Or does it stay in your pocket and find other uses at home? And there are many, many uses at home for someone who has a good night, waiting table, for example. Then wherever they want to, and I mentioned the barcode and paying at retail stores, whatever channel they prefer, and without convenience fees and charges. That again, I said any of these issues could be a whole presentation in and of itself. I'm sure many of you have fought many fights on convenience fees and charges. I'll leave it to questions if people want to go further with that. But basically, the one thing is challenge the 30-day bill, the premise of the 30-day bill cycle. 30 days works really well if you get paid every 30 days. A lot of people simply are not paid every 30 days. Why are you sending them a bill the way you think they ought to be paid? They would love to have a job that pays them every 30 days, perhaps like many of us have, but they don't live in that world, so why are you billing them every 30 days? Next slide. So this is my final slide. I said I've got some examples here of different things that have been done or tried. Some of them have some names that some of you may recognize. And obviously I'm not going to take the time now to go through these, but just saying that, for example, budget billing, let's at least have it enhanced budget billing, have predictive and proactive alerts. Why is it effective? That you give people tools so they avoid surprises from the true-ups, and you're encouraging more incremental payments. So I think you see a theme here that there are people that have sufficient money. It's just that the way they've been interacting with the utility doesn't work for their lifestyle and for the way for the reality that they live in. So provide them with the best services you can. It doesn't mean that none of them will get into problems, but the likelihood is most of them will stay out of problems if they have the tools, and that allows utilities and community action agencies and consumer advocates and so forth to focus much more attention on that lower left quadrant where there are serious problems and we need serious programs and more funding. So I will pause there. Thank you very much for your patience.
Nat, thank you so much. Very provocative and interesting, and lots of material to study later. As you said, we could have spent, the whole session on any one of the presentations that we had today, but unfortunately we are out of time. So I want to quickly thank the folks that did send in questions. We'll try to make a note of the questions and perhaps get back to you one-on-one. If we can do that, I'll have to talk with the NRRI folks about the feasibility of that. I want to extend a big thanks to the panelists, again, who have shared their time and their expertise today and in the past, and I really hope that we can continue this work together. And also a big thanks to the NRRI staff and the NSUCA staff and the NARUC staff. And I'm going to turn it over now to Charlene Ketchum and David Springy, who are going to quickly talk about next steps in the work that we've been doing here together. And then I'll have them turn it directly over to Catherine to sign us off. So thanks very much, everyone. Charlene and David, you are up.
Okay, just very quickly. The intent is for the NARUC Committee on Consumers and the Public Interest to have this passed as a resolution during the NARUC annual meeting next month in San Antonio. So the plan is for us to discuss this during our next call next week with the CPI committee, and then submit this to NARUC for consideration and for the committee to vote on it. And then I'll turn it over to David to discuss the NSUCA process.
Hi, and thank you. So NSUCA will follow along just probably behind NARUC a little bit. Once we get the draft resolution, and we'll wait and see what comes out of the committee call with the NARUC CPI committee, which I believe is October 21st. It will be sent to our Consumer Protection Committee. We'll likely, if we have a firm draft and we have something that we're confident that we know that NARUC is good with, we'll take that up likely on our November 6th Consumer Protection Committee call, and if passed, it would go to the floor of the NSUCA meeting. Just as a 2-second plug, just because I know we have a lot of commissioners and commission staff on there, I just wanted to let you know that NSUCA does have its annual meeting at the same time and location as NARUC. We will be in San Antonio, I believe on the 3rd floor of the convention center. And the NSUCA meeting is open to all commissioners and commission staff, so I do hope that you guys would take an opportunity to come by and take a look. Our agenda ends up on the NARUC app, or you can look at our website, nsuka.org, and there's a meeting link to the meeting page up front. But we will hopefully take that up, and then, as I understand it, Charlene, we will also be doing a joint committee or joint meeting on Sunday at the meeting. Again, sort of hopefully wrapping this year-long work together up at that meeting. So with luck, we'll be following along just behind NARUC, and hopefully we'll be able to pass this joint resolution through our processes.
Hey, thank you very much, Charlene and David. Really quickly before we leave in the last minute, I want to talk about the upcoming NRRI webinar for this is in November. But for November, we're talking about plain old energy market services, and that will be with our NRI principal researcher, Tom Stanton. And so this will be in November. For more information, please go to the NRR website at nrri.org. Or you can also find us through the NARUC website if that's easier. And then I also wanted to give a quick plug for the NARUC CPI Innovation Webinar Series, and that's being hosted every Thursday up until December. And so the next webinar for this series through NARUC CPI group will be the Using Energy Efficiency to Meet Peak Demand webinar, and that's going to be November 7th at 2018. And once again, if you're interested in either of these webinars, you can just go to naruc.org and then find the NRRI or the CPI section, and you should be able to sign up from there. So before I close, I wanted to say thank you to our wonderful panelists and Commissioner Gold, CPI and NSUCA. You guys have been really helpful, and I appreciate all your hard work on this. Have a good afternoon.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye.